Hi everyone. Let's have a brief introduction of threat modeling. Threat modeling is a structured approach to identify any security threats or concerns in an application that we are going to build. The best possible time to threat model our application is during the requirement specification or design phase of software development lifecycle. The benefit of threat modeling during the requirement specification or design phase is shift left. If the potential design flaws or security threats in an application design can be identified in the earliest possible phases of software development lifecycle, better it is. It helps us to avoid the cost involved in redesigning and fixing the security concerns if those threats would have identified later in the software development lifecycle. Another benefit of threat modeling in the earlier phases of software development lifecycle is that once a threat model has been built, then it can be leveraged in the later phases of software development lifecycle. For instance, if a software engineer at the time of his first attempt of implementation of application is already aware of threat model, then he can make use of that threat model to implement the appropriate remediation controls at the same time. In order to threat model, first of all, we have to identify the threat surface. Threat surface is comprised of all those components of the application design, all those process flows, all those input controls, request and response, communication channel that can be vulnerable to any security threat. Once the threat surface has been identified, then the next part of threat modeling is use a list of common threats as our guideline. We use the list of common threads as our guideline in order to identify any existing actual threats in our application design. Stride is one of those categorized threat lists. Stride has 6 threat categories. Spoofing includes all those flaws or weaknesses that a malicious actor can exploit in order to pretend to be someone that he is not. Tampering includes all those flaws that a malicious actor can exploit in order to distort original data or functionality. Repudiation includes all those flaws that a malicious actor can exploit in order to make a source of an activity unidentifiable. Information disclosure includes all those flaws or weaknesses that a malicious actor can exploit to breach the confidentiality. Denial of service includes all those flaws that a malicious actor can exploit to make a service unavailable. Elevation of privileges includes all those flaws that a malicious actor can exploit in order to assign higher privileges to a user that he is not entitled to. Threat modeling lifecycle has 4 stages. In the first phase of threat modeling lifecycle, we need to draw an application architectural workflow diagram. That diagram should not be way too abstract and it should not be way too detailed. It should at least delineate some major components, how those components are connected with each other, what is the process flow, data flow, communication channel, request and response of this application design should be delineated. Once we have the architectural workflow diagram, then the next phase of threat modeling lifecycle is to identify the threats. In order to identify the threats, we can either make use of an attack tree as our guideline, or we can make use of a categorized threat list as our guideline in order to identify the actual existing threats in our application design. Stride is one of those well-known categorized threat lists. Instead of using Stride, we can also use OWASP Top 10 threat list. Alternatively, we can also use CWE Top 25 threat list. Once the threats have been identified, then in the third phase of threat modeling lifecycle, we identify and implement the remediation controls associated with those threats we have identified in phase 2. In the fourth phase, we validate the remediation controls, whether those remediation controls have actually mitigated the security threat or not. In phase 4, we also validate whether the overall posture of the application design, security posture, has been improved or not. So let's just discuss threat modeling in practice. So here is a user story. There is an existing and functional authentication web page based on username and password credential. We need to add additional functionality, that is, the logging should also include two-factor authentication. So let's just see how we can draw a diagram for this user story. This diagram is a very basic diagram which shows at least a server-side component and what we need to add in this server-side component. The process flow will be something like this. The user will have to tap the send code button, and then a request will be sent to the server, and then the server will fetch the user's mobile phone number from the database and will send it to the user's phone number with a code number, and then the user will use that code number received on his mobile phone number to enter it in this authentication code user control. And then when a user tap the login, then all this information, including username, password, and authentication code number, will be sent to the server, where the server will validate that if all this information is correct, then the login attempt will be successful. Once we have drawn the diagram, then the next phase of threat modeling is to identify the threats. We identify these threats based on our knowledge as well as using our threat category list guideline. So the first threat we can identify is that a malicious actor can attempt to inject malicious script in the code number, user input control, or in any other user input control. And that malicious script can attempt to tamper the functionality or even tamper the data. Therefore, this threat can belong to the tampering threat category. Another threat is that when the server sends the code number to the user's mobile phone, then that code number can be intercepted. And if it happens, then this threat belongs to the threat category information disclosure. Another possible threat is that the login attempts can be unidentified due to the lack of auditing or logging. This threat belongs to the threat category repudiation. So once we have identified some threats, the next phase of threat modeling lifecycle is to find out and implement the mitigation controls. So the corresponding mitigation controls should be implement input validation at each user input control on the login page so that we can validate that malicious script should not be entered. Another mitigation control is that whenever a response is sent from the server to the user's mobile phone, then it should always be encrypted. Another mitigation control is log all the login attempts at the server side. Now we move forward to the fourth phase of our threat modeling lifecycle, where we can perform the black box testing by injecting the malicious script in the code number user input control or other user input controls and see whether our malicious injected script can be accepted or it's rejected by our application. Another validation we can perform is to ensure whether the code number response is properly encrypted when it is sent from the server to the user's phone number. Another validation is check the logs. Therefore, this is an example that we have discussed today. However, this is a very basic threat modeling. In order to further elaborate this threat modeling practice, we can make use a threat modeling tool. So I'm going to discuss that threat modeling tool, Microsoft Threat Modeling Tool, in our next part of threat modeling discussion. Thank you for this part 1 of threat modeling introduction.